Hey, Ecology, it's Vish Shettery again with your next section of notes on biodiversity. This unit is about biodiversity at risk, and we're going to be looking at a bunch of different concepts, vocabulary terms, and issues that are threatening our biodiversity on this planet. So we'll start with some terms to know. Some of these should be familiar with you. It's just kind of polishing up or reminding you of their definitions as we move forward. So the first word is extinct. I think we all know this. An extinct species is one that no longer exists on Earth. Rest in peace, dodos. Extant means a species is currently alive. And this is a term that students often struggle with. It doesn't mean that it's thriving. It doesn't mean that it's in danger. It means there is at least one somewhere on the planet, but there could be millions, or there could be one. Right? It just means that there is a living member of that species alive on our planet, like this pelican here. Okay? Next, endangered species. Endangered species is a classification that's used by a number of different groups and governments to classify a species that is likely to go extinct in the near future if we do not fix it soon. Okay? Like if we are not immediately activating some protective measures, whether that's setting aside habitat, setting up laws to prevent poaching, whatever the case may be, this species is very much in danger, as the name might hint at. It's in danger of going extinct. Species that are most at risk. There are certain categories or certain reasons that some species are more likely to become endangered than others. The first is migratory species. By far, the biggest reason that species go extinct is a lack of habitat, mostly due to us and our population increasing and taking up more spaces. This is especially dangerous for migratory species because they rely on multiple habitats and they can't just suddenly say, you know what, I'm not going to fly south for the winter anymore. It's not good there. There's too many people. It's crowded at that beach. Okay. Migratory species need both of their habitats to provide for all of their needs at whatever time of the year that they are there. And so if one of those habitats is damaged or disappears, their entire thousands of year life pattern that their species has undergone is suddenly thrown into chaos, and it's not easy to recover from that. Next is organisms that need a very specialized habitat. An organism that needs very specific resources is going to really struggle because it's not easy, again, to shift your behaviors when that habitat is threatened. So in our last lesson, we talked about cheetahs and how cheetahs need to have very large habitats in order to engage in the running races that they do in order to pick a mate, but also just have enough territory to hunt. They really need their bursts of speed in a hunt to successfully fell prey because they can't run fast for long, but they can run very quickly. And so if they don't have a large enough space to really do that, prey can very easily get away from them. They also can't change direction very easily, so they need open spaces. Specialized food sources is another big concern for the same reason that I've already mentioned. Like if you only eat one thing, and that one thing is gone, looking at you, panda bears, okay, suddenly you don't have an alternate food source. And while it's easy to say, well, they can just eat something else, when a species has eaten the same thing for thousands of years, they don't magically just start eating other stuff. Okay? And then I kind of mentioned this with cheetahs, but large habitats, as well as specialized or needing certain things, but needing that size of a habitat can also be a concern. Okay. The last one is that they are exploited for human use. There are lots of species whose numbers have plummeted solely because we as people want something about them. One of the primary examples of this would be ivory. Lots of species of elephants have either gone extinct or become very much endangered because humans hunt them for the ivory in their tusks. They kill them, take their ivory, and then there's one less of that species, or they cut off their tusks and then they can't do some of the things they need their tusks for, and they will eventually die as well. So humans are exploiting them. They're overusing that resource. Now, that's not the same as hunting. Okay, when we hunt in the United States, generally speaking, unless you're breaking the law, you're hunting certain species that's populations have been deemed to be at such a size that they need to be culled. And so we kind of help to population control through hunting. But if you're poaching, you're hunting out of season, you're hunting a species that is illegal to hunt, then that would also be considered exploitation. Threatened species, like the sandhill crane in this picture, in some places is considered a threatened species. In some areas it isn't anymore because we've had good efforts to rebound their population. But threatened species just means that their population is in a significant enough decline that we need to be concerned about it. That's different than the patterns of increase and decrease that happen over time based on availability of food source. This is like a consistent and steady year after year decline. And based on that decline, if something doesn't change, it is likely that species is going to become endangered and then potentially extinct. So threatened is also like a specific distinction that we give species. There are like limits for them that decide whether or not that species has become threatened, and governments and action groups give them that specific moniker, which kind of puts them on sort of a watch list. So we need to be aware of, hey, how is this species doing? What are some interactions we can take to try and improve the species population? And if that doesn't work, obviously, then they become listed as endangered. And then we have even larger scale interventions that we try to put into place, um, both as individual governments at the national level, but also there are some groups like the WWF, the World Wildlife Federation, that work together in multiple countries to try and improve different outcomes for different species. An endemic species. An endemic species is one that is native to a certain area. So, great example of endemic species are those that are native to Hawaii. There's a lot of birds that are native to Hawaii and are really only found there because Hawaii is a chain of islands and it's not easy for small birds. Okay, they can fly maybe from island to island, but they can't really get other places because it's too far away for them to fly. They don't have the energy or the resources to get from Hawaii to California. And so those endemic species are native to that area. And like we talked about earlier, they're more likely to become endangered because they have a very specialized habitat with the ecosystem, the climate, et cetera, of those islands. Um, so endemic species are also only found in that area. So we can't find pretty much any of the birds in Hawaii are not found elsewhere. I went to Hawaii this past summer with Mr. Yan, and that was definitely one of the big things that we noticed is all of the birds there looked very different. I was definitely that tourist who took a bunch of weird bird pictures of birds who I have no idea what they were, but they looked very different and very cool from what we saw. Um, or what I should say, what we see at home. We also spent a couple days touring. We went to the aquarium and the zoo, and especially at the zoo, they talked a lot about the different endemic species to Hawaii and why they had become endangered, and in some cases, why they were now extinct. Partially because there's nowhere else for those populations to go. If the population dies on the islands, they can't just go and get more and import them from elsewhere to take that place. They're done. Exotic or alien species are those that are not native to a particular area. And in some cases, they will become, as we'll talk about in a minute, invasive species. Basically, exotic or alien species just means that they got there not naturally, which is kind of a key word for we brought them there. That was us. Um, Sometimes on purpose and sometimes on accident. So sometimes we accidentally bring exotic species with us to new places because they're like in our food or on our vessels, like our ships. That's how we got zebra mussels in the Great Lakes, and how it's continuing to spread to other waterways throughout the United States. And sometimes we bring them there on purpose because we think that, oh, this species will help to control the population of another species, and then it just gets out of control. Shocker. Sometimes we make mistakes. So you can see on this slide that there's actually a recipe for fried snake. Guam has an invasive species problem for alien brown snakes. And it literally has gotten so bad on the island that the government, the Division of Agriculture that you can see on the from the kitchen of section, literally have like created cookbooks of recipes trying to get people to like kill and eat these snakes because there's thousands of them per square mile. It's just crazy. And the reason that that happens, and we'll move to invasive species, is that it's very easy for an alien species to become invasive. And that means that they take over the new area they find themselves in and start to negatively affect the endemic or the native species because they don't have any natural predators in this area. They don't have anything that's designed in their food webs to eat them or help control their population. And so they just kind of insert themselves in there and then breed and use resources like crazy. Zebra mussels in the Great Lakes are a really good example of this. Um, lots and lots of examples of this happening all around the world. In the southern part of the United States, there's a plant species called kudzu. It's a vine, and it was brought to the American South to actually try and act as erosion control. So trying to like protect the soil, especially in areas that are pretty dry, because it's a vine. It can kind of has like a root system that keeps the soil secure. But what happened is that kudzu grows really well and really effectively. It's not native to the area, and nothing else eats it. So kudzu has taken over forests and wildlife areas and just basically strangled out native plants. Extinction, we're going to talk a little bit more about it. Obviously, that means, again, that a species is now gone. It's not found on the earth. I also want to talk a little bit more about that phenomenon and some of the concerns because extinction is the number one threat to biodiversity on the planet. Everything else feeds into extinction. So, habitat loss and pollution, climate change, all of those things cause species over time to go extinct. And that creates an overall decrease, not just in species diversity, but in functional diversity, in all of those different genetic issues, et cetera, because you just have less different varieties of things. Okay. And when you have less species, they can create fewer new species over time, lots of problems. So it is estimated, again, we use historical records, looking at how many species have gone extinct over time, et cetera. But it's estimated that 99.9% of all the species that have ever existed have gone extinct. Okay? Extinction is kind of the opposite of speciation, a word that I mentioned earlier. Speciation is the creation of new species, generally due to something like continental drift or gradual climate changes, or sometimes rapid climate changes caused by catastrophic events that leave openings for the species to change, for their genetics to shift. And when those genetics shift enough, we consider them a new species from what has previously existed. Um, so speciation and extinction both happen due to the same mechanisms. A new species is developed because they had a better trait, and the original population goes extinct. In some cases, like continental drift, the species doesn't always necessarily go extinct. You just now have two separate populations that are considered now two separate species because over time they become genetically different enough from one another. I know we talk about that a lot in biology, and so there's a concept that comes back up and gets really important. So extinction happens naturally, and that's something important to know. Like species go extinct, that is a normal occurrence. We call the normal rate of species extinction background extinction. That's what we would normally expect to happen because, as we know, as we talked about last unit, like ecosystems aren't stable. Okay, they aren't just sitting there static. Everything is changing all the time. Species populations go up, they go down in response to one another, in response to environmental changes, in response to all sorts of different stimuli and inputs. Okay, so background extinction is considered normal. Generally speaking, we consider anywhere from 1 to 5 species going extinct in a year be the normal rate. Again, looking at historical extinction data, fossil records, et cetera, we kind of have made that approximation. Okay. Um, we've kind of talked about this already. when we talk about the impacts of biodiversity, extinctions impacts on biodiversity, we can kind of measure the biodiversity level or change by looking at the number of speciations minus the number of extinctions. Like, have more new species been created than have gone extinct, then that's going to result in an increase in biodiversity. Okay. And we know that just like changes in ecosystems, just like secondary succession creates opportunities, extinction itself creates opportunities for whatever species are left behind to kind of fill in those roles and fill in those niches in those communities. So extinction in and of itself is not necessarily bad. Okay. The problem comes when extinction happens outside of the normal expected rate. And we call that a mass extinction. That's any period of time where there is a significant increase in the amount of species that are going extinct in a given year or in a given time frame. Okay, so we've had mass extinctions throughout the course of Earth's history. Depending on what source you look at, I have several different books and resources that say different things. We estimate that there are about 5 mass extinctions throughout the history of Earth. Some will say that there were 2 mass extinctions and 3 mass depletions. It's really semantics on the number of species and how picky you want to be. For our purposes, we say there are about 5 mass extinction events in the last 500 million years. Okay? So again, it doesn't really matter to me how you remember that. 5 major events throughout the history of our planet where a bunch of species have gone extinct, like concerningly high levels. Okay? Those usually happened because of some cataclysmic ecological event. And we know, like in talking and learning about dinosaurs, that what that event is up for discussion. There are different theories based on the evidence we have because they happened so long ago. But 5 mass extinctions, lots of things going extinct, which then creates lots of opportunities for other organisms. One of the things we looked at last unit was that the dying off of the dinosaurs was really prime for the introduction or really the flourishing of mammals. Like, mammals would have not taken over the planet if the dinosaurs were still there, because they would have eaten us, and that would be bad. Okay. So, looking at our current time period, we know, based on all of the evidence and all of the data, that we are in the middle of the 6th mass extinction event on the planet. During the 20th century, extinction rates, depending on the source, depending on the data, have fluctuated from anywhere to 100 to 10,000 times faster than is considered the natural background rate. And that is a big problem because that idea of speciation, okay, only works as a biodiverse balance with extinction when they can happen in pair with one another. And the rate at which species go extinct during a mass extinction, the rate that they're going extinct now, is way too fast for speciation to keep up. So we're not having enough development of new species to account for the species that we're losing. Okay. Based on the estimations, again, all estimations, but based on the data that we have about the rates of extinction that we've seen in the first part of the century and that we will continue to see moving forward, we estimate that it will take about 5 million years to create as many species as we have and are likely to continue losing throughout the rest of the century. Okay, and that's a big concerning number, obviously. Okay, because as we talked about in our notes last week, biodiversity is important for a healthy ecosystem. We need that biodiversity, we need those differences because as things change, more biodiversity makes the planet, the species on it, more able to adjust to those fluctuations over time. There are certainly some things that make parts of the planet and species within the planet at a greater risk for going extinct and for biodiversity decreasing. So places like tropical rainforests are generally at higher risk because they have such specific environmental conditions that the organisms in them can't really adjust to the changes that are happening. Also, because there's a lot of destruction of rainforests going on right now, which takes away habitat. Coral reefs in the ocean, when we talk a little bit about climate change in our last unit, we'll talk more about coral reefs and ocean pH levels and how those are increasing to the point where organisms just can't survive in coral reefs. And coral reefs themselves are dying, which means all the organisms that depend on them are dying. Coastlines are at bigger risk, again, for that kind of that same reason. Any place that has a really unique habitat, or in the case of a coastline, is the meeting of two habitats, is of greater concern because there are more specific environmental conditions there than there are in other places. And in a lot of cases, it also there's no opportunity for organisms to migrate elsewhere. Islands, because again, they are trapped, are at greater risk. There are also some places on the planet that are hotspots for high levels of biodiversity that then really need to be protected. Anywhere where there's a high number of endemic species diversity is a hotspot, um, and that includes most of the very threatened areas of the world. Like our areas with the biggest biodiversity are also the areas that we tend to be using for that biodiversity, which creates further threats. In a lot of those places, we're seeing a huge loss of vegetation and plant life. And as we know, plant life is like the start of how energy becomes functional on our planet. So those are really important to have. In the United States, our major hotspots for biodiversity include the Florida Everglades, the California coastal region, specifically the Floristic province, which has a lot of unique environmental conditions. Hawaii, and if you ever have the chance to go to Hawaii and see and tour, there's a lot of great places there. The zoo in Honolulu, again, had a lot of great information about some of these issues. Our prairies in the Midwest actually are considered biodiversity hotspots. The openness of the areas, the vastness of the prairies creates a lot of opportunities for living organisms. The Pacific Northwest forests, those are considered temperate rainforests, and so they're a pretty unique habitat. There's not a lot of temperate rainforests in the world. Those are all going to be some biodiversity hotspots. You can see on this image, these are some of the global biodiversity hotspots, so places outside of the United States as well, that just have very unique ecosystems and thus very unique species that rely on those. So biodiversity, again, it's extremely important. And there are lots of things right now that are putting it at risk. We're going to continue to examine some of these concepts as we move forward. We'll look at some of the things that cause populations to flourish and also to flounder as we move forward. As always, if you have questions, let me know. Hope you guys are well. Miss you. Take care.